that's all right with everyone. I don't see anyone running away. Go ahead and try to share my screen. And where is it? Everybody there?
Yes.
Good. Okay. I just want to again say welcome to Episcopal 101, and I'm going to begin with a prayer from the old Book of Common Prayer, right? There are many wonderful prayers in there that we'll get to experience a few of over the next 4 weeks, and it is up on your screen now for you to read along with me. Mindful that God is with us, let us pray. Lord Jesus, stay with us, for evening is at hand and the day is past. Be our companion in the way, kindle our hearts and awaken hope, that we may know you as you are revealed in Scripture and in the breaking of bread. Grant this for the sake of your love. Amen. So, most of you already know this because you're much more tech savvy than I am, but Jesse, I think, has already muted everybody. And if you need to have a question or have a tech issue, don't hesitate to make all kinds of crazy signs or say something in chat, and Jesse will have a chance to interpret for me, which will be really nice. This is a screenshot of one of the early St. Paul's staff meetings right after we went into sheltering in faith, as I like to say, and we're getting a little bit better at it. So what I'd like to do very briefly is just kind of have a chance for us to go around and introduce one another. And I've got 3 questions for you to ponder, and I'll start so that you have a little more time to go for it. But the first question is one thing which you find engaging about the Episcopal Church, and then one thing which you especially hope to have a better understanding a month from now concerning the Episcopal Church. And then, just because I'm curious, how many times this week have you been on Zoom or some other related conference calling? So one thing that I find particularly engaging about the church, and just to, in the interest of what do they call it? To reveal it all, I'm a cradle Episcopalian. I was baptized about 6 weeks after I was born, and I continue to learn new things about the Episcopal Church, one of which is that we are not a static religious body, that we evolve, and I like to think of us as being part of creation theology, where we're kind of co-creators with God, and we see ourselves that way. And the church is just sort of evolving as it goes on, which is really wonderful. And so one thing I especially hope to have a better understanding a month from now is how you all see the church in this brief period of time. And as the archivist for the Diocese of Ohio, the last session that I'm going to do with you is a history of our diocese and a history of St. Paul's Church. And I find that to be pretty fascinating stuff. So I'm going to appreciate being able to delve into the history of St. Paul's to put together a presentation for you on that. This week I will be on Zoom a total of 7 times, so that's about once a week. So I'm just going to go around and call out your names, and if you wouldn't, Jesse will unmute you, or you can try to unmute you and then give us the answer. So Ed, would you be, since you're taking a sip off of your soda, would you be willing to go next?
Hey. Hello, everybody. My name is Ed Alex, and good to be here. Good to be here this evening. Before I say any more, I have to apologize that I have to leave the meeting early. I have another commitment to tie in with this, but that's okay. One thing that I find engaging or very interesting about the Episcopal Church is that it's very flexible. It's not as rigid as, and I'm a cradle to just recent Catholic, so I'm brought up in the Catholic tradition, which is not too much different in many ways to the Episcopal tradition. A lot of the things are very similar to prayers and what have you. However, I do find that the flexibility and the diversity and there's some rigidity, but not as quite as structured as I'm used to, which I find very enjoying. And one thing that I hope to have a better understanding, I guess I have a better understanding of how this whole thing works. I mean, I'm pretty familiar with the cycle because it's the similar cycle. The Catholics use the same cycles and all that. So that stuff is pretty, but I'm really interested into seeing how the church is, how this particular community of St. Paul's operates as a community. Within a larger community. You know, we're in the community of Cleveland Heights, but then we're also in the Diocese of Cleveland, the greater. And so I'd be interested to see how that works. It doesn't seem to be as provincial as the structures I'm used to, which I think is interesting. And how many times a week are you on Zoom? Oh, a ton of times. You mean, I'd probably go to 20 Zoom meetings a week for various things. So I start my day with one at 6:30 in the morning every day, and go forward from that. So this is my third one today, and then I got one more after this. So I find them great. Maybe we'll just keep it this way, and you know, we can sell the church. Who knows? Anyway, that's all I have, folks.
Well, it's a good way to stay connected. Thanks so much, Ed.
Yeah, the utilities will be far cheaper.
Yeah. John White, how about you next?
All right. I too am a cradle Episcopalian. I was baptized about 18 months after I was born. My parents helped start an Episcopal church in El Paso, Texas. And so I grew up, you know, I was an acolyte and, you know, EYC and all of that and stuff. So I spent a lot of time, you know, with the Episcopal Church. What I like about the Episcopal Church is the accepting nature of the diverse groups, you know, that come to church and stuff. So I think that is one of the things that I have really drawn me always back to the Episcopal Church and stuff. The one thing that I'd like to know or have a better understanding is how the church has evolved. When the service that I grew up with is not the same now. And so trying to understand how things like the Nicene Creed has changed and so forth is something that I would really hope to get a better understanding. I am on Zoom a lot because I'm working from home. So all my connections to everybody at campus, I work for Case Western Reserve. And so I'm on between 25 and 30 Zoom meetings a week.
Wow, that's a lot.
All right.
Thank you, John. Caniela.
My turn. Great. Thank you. So let's see here. So my name's Caniela Nelson. Let's see here. One thing that I find engaging about the Episcopal Church, the various communities that I'm tied to, ranging from, God, there's so many of them. Anyway, just a couple nights ago, I was with I'm with the bell choir. So one of the things that I love about that is before joining the Episcopal Church, I was a rabid consumer of music. Basically lost my desire to create music several decades ago, and when I got to St. Paul's, joined up with the bell choir and absolutely love it. Let's see here. Also, I'm in EFM, the Education for Ministry. So just been taking in as much as possible about the Episcopal Church. As well as, I mean, basically any chance that I could actually offer anything to the church and help out, I'm there pretty much. I think I am. One thing which I especially hope to have a better understanding a month from now concerning the Episcopal Church, the history of it. I just find it really interesting that, you know, for many decades of my life, I tried finding a spiritual home and I couldn't find it, just because there are so many things that weren't matching up. And Just finding the Episcopal Church was a blessing. A friend and an atheist told me about the Episcopal Church, and when I arrived, it was everything that I was looking for. So yeah, the history is really important to me. How did we get to where we are today? And how many times a week am I on Zoom? This is my third meeting this week. So Monday I was with the bell choir. Last night I was with my EFM class, and then tonight I'm with you guys.
That's great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Kevin et al.
Hey, good evening, everybody. I think, and I don't want to speak for Michelle, but I think for me, trying to find what's engaging is that I'm still learning and trying to find what it is necessarily from the church that really is speaking to us, or to me as an individual, but also us as a family. I didn't grow up and wasn't raised in any kind of religious faith or background where Michelle grew up in a Catholic family. And so together, we're trying to find a place that fits for us. And as we've researched and visited different churches, St. Paul's, I think within a couple of visits really spoke to us. It may have been the Christmas or Christmas Eve gathering that really, we just kind of looked at each other and was like, this is it. This is where we ought to be. So I think we're trying to figure that out for ourselves. And I think what's engaging for me personally is balancing the structure of what I'm finding from our visits to the church, but also with the social diversity and the intentionality around that. I find that very appealing. What I'd like to know a month from now more is one of my big spiritual goals and personal goals is to work through baptism. Michelle and I have an 8-month-old son who we hope to get baptized through the church, and I'd like to be a part of that with him. So to have a better understanding, not about the symbolism, but the ritual around it and the larger meaning of the act itself. I'm also at higher ed. I'm at Tri-C at the community college. I work there, so I'm on meetings. I quit counting. I don't know how many times I'm doing this throughout the week or throughout the day. It varies, but I'm doing something like this quite a bit throughout the week.
Hi everyone. So just to add, to what Kevin shared for us as a family, for myself personally, as he mentioned, I was raised Catholic, and not just raised Catholic, but like Catholic grade school, Catholic high school, campus ministry, like super Catholic. And that was great for me for a time. And I feel like I came to a place where I, for lack of a better term, outgrew it. And it didn't really fit with some of my adult priorities and thinking. And I feel, especially with us, reconnecting and getting married and then starting a family, finding that spiritual home has been really important. And it's been a little bit of a journey as we did some research and then tried out a few places. And I think what's really engaging about the Episcopal Church is there's still enough of my faith background tradition and those sacred rituals there, but there's a lot of very intentional welcoming of all people and diversity and progressive values. At least that's the impression I have so far, and that's appealing to me. I'm hoping to learn more, as others have said, about the history of the church, and for me specifically, how it differs from Catholicism, just so I have in my mind a clear vision of what fits where and what's what, and make sure it's not just my assumptions, and make sure it's the correct understanding, because I want to support Kevin in his baptism journey, and then also prepare our son Everett too. Wonderful. And as I prepare to join the church. Thanks. Oh, and on Zoom, I'm not on Zoom a lot, maybe once a week, but I work at a hospital, so we're doing more Skype for business. So not as cool as Zoom, but still a little bit of the same action.
Yep, indeed. Thank you. Rebecca.
Hi guys, I'm Rebecca Cullers. I started attending St. Paul's around Easter last year. I grew up in the greater Cleveland area, and so I'm kind of homegrown. One thing that I find engaging about the Episcopal Church, it's a struggle. Oh, is my video gone? Let me see. Oops. My bad. I didn't mean to turn off the video. I guess I bumped it when I unmuted myself. Everything went dark. So something that I find engaging about the Episcopal Church is also kind of a struggle for me. I was raised Southern Baptist, so evangelical, and lots of rules and regulations about everything, like what was okay and what wasn't, and forbidden, and da-da-da. And so I know that it's not the reality, but it seems to me when I come to the Episcopal Church that there are like no rules at all. It's kind of, it is engaging for me, but it also sometimes I'm like, well, wait, what about what this says here biblically, da-da-da. So it intrigues me a lot around that. Something that I hope to have a better understanding of is sounds maybe sort of blithe, but like everything, just because having attended services, I'm somewhat familiar with the liturgical year and just seeing what goes on, but I have sort of longed just for a course just like this. So I was really happy when Jesse reached out that this was happening, because I've wanted to get like a better idea around the framework, the basic ideology and approach of the Episcopal Church.
Great.
I am on Zoom probably 3 or 4 times a week. So I enjoy it. It's a nice way to connect. Some people that have said they're on 20 and 30 meetings, it's like, ugh, sounds like a lot. So I feel for you on that.
Thank you. Amia.
Hi, everyone. Okay, so my name's Amia. I've actually only been attending St. Paul's since the end of January, I think. So I've been to in person like 4 times before the shutdown. But I came to St. Paul's and started doing research on joining an Episcopal church because of some of the things that you all have said about it being progressive, but also traditional at the same time. I really like the balance that I've seen so far. And Jessie very nicely, I sent her an email a few weeks ago asking for some more reading, so that's kind of been helping as well. One thing that I'd like to have a better understanding of is the history. So I'm a librarian and actually specialize in archives, so I am very interested in anything history-wise or the archives, anything like that. And then how many times a week am I on Zoom? Probably 3 to 5 times, sometimes with work meetings, sometimes just for social.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Amber.
I'm terrible with Zoom. As
You're
you
doing
can
very
see.
well.
Okay, so let me see, go back. Thing I find the most intriguing, I guess, is how accepting it is. I like that I can come to church with my girlfriend and not be like a really big deal. That's something that's really important to us. Something I want to learn a month from now. I'm kind of just want to know more about the church. I kind of grew up with different backgrounds. I went to a Lutheran school, gone to Baptist and Methodist church, and my ex was Catholic, so here I am with this. Just kind of just want to learn more about it. And the Zoom meetings, I'd say maybe once every like 2 weeks, I guess. Maybe even that, not too often. Hey.
That's
Sorry,
great.
my dog.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Michelle.
Hi there. I'm Michelle Smolin. I've been steeped in religion my entire life. I grew up in a really liberal family, but insanely Catholic. Baptized into the Byzantine Catholic Church, raised in by rite, so we would do 2 liturgies a weekend, and I was really into it because I was a complete dork. I I also was in the convent for 14 years. So I was a Sister of Mercy. I learned about St. Paul because I came to Case Western to go to graduate school, and I lived at Beaumont. So I would always come to St. Paul's for evensong and for the concerts. So how am I back? I have 2 sons, and participating in St. Anne's, I wanted my sons, of course, to have all the sacraments of initiation, which they did. But by the time my son Xavier, who was an acolyte, was confirmed, I just realized that was it. We were done with the Catholic Church. It didn't fit anything that I wanted to teach my son. There were times when they were preaching, and I use that loosely because they're terrible preachers. When I would say to him, we need to leave, because I didn't want him to hear these things. I didn't want him to hear the things that I didn't believe. And after his confirmation, we never went back. So that was 3 years ago. I joined the choir at St. Paul's, and I've been here ever since. What I find engaging is so much of everything that kind of catches my heart. So first of all, the inexplicable draw that kind of matches all of the spirituality that I think I've gathered like a stone. I find it so overwhelming when I see Jesse and Jeannie vested. And you know what? In the Catholic Church, I hated the vestments, right? It was just a bunch of guys in dresses, and it represented, tyranny and the hierarchy. Now, it's completely opened my eyes to a different kind of view and vision, a respect of mutuality, that everybody has different roles. And so that just, it really kind of blows me away. So the opportunity to be a full member in a church that says every week, wherever you are, you're welcome at the table. I think it's unparalleled in my experience. What I want to understand more is I want to understand the church that I belong to now. I know what I experience, I know what liturgy is like, I know what the people are like, but I don't really understand like the grounding principles or why the Episcopal Church is who it is. So I don't think it's critical, but I would like to know better so that when I talk more about it, it's more than just kind of an experiential sharing. It's more grounded in some kind of real theological understanding. I'm not on Zoom very much, thank God. It makes my eyes crazy. But I work from home, and we do a lot of phone conferences. So I'd love to be working in my sweatshirt and my pajamas.
Excellent.
That's it.
Thank you, Michelle. Kelsey.
Michelle made me tear up. Okay, I'm Kelsey Ferguson. I actually have a relatively funny upbringing because I went to St. Paul's as a kid. But before that, my parents went to an evangelical, like Baptist church in somewhere else in Cleveland Heights. And we eventually found our home at St. Paul's, but I was raised Baptist. And looking back on that now, like my mom was raised Catholic. I think my dad was raised Lutheran, or I'm not sure, but we ended up at a Baptist church. And then as soon as I started going to St. Paul's, I felt like, okay, like I am comfortable here. This is wonderful. But I will say I admired the teamwork that the youth leaders at our church have right now, Leah and Lauren. I think they do an amazing job because our kids, in my eyes at least, I feel them understanding things really well, and they're able to tell me all these stories, and like they're wrapping their heads around it. And I don't feel like I got that formation when I was growing up. And like, I wasn't baptized as a baby. I was baptized at St. Paul's the week before my confirmation because you had to be baptized to be confirmed. So, yeah, I wish I had more understanding of the whole formative process. And my dad kind of, when I asked him about the Episcopal Church as a kid, he basically told me Alan Gates was the rector at the time, but whoever is working at St. Paul's, he told me that if you go to them with a story and say, like, I literally believe that Jesus turned water into wine, I think that happened, your rector will look at you and say, I support that, I think that's wonderful. And if you come to them and say, I don't believe that, but this is how I'm interpreting the story into my life, and this is what I can learn from it and what I can do with it, your rector will say, yes, I support that. And so that like little bit is what I think Episcopalianism is, and that's why I'm taking this class, because I want a much broader understanding. And I'm a violinist. I'm in like my teaching studio right now in my house, so I'm on Zoom every day of the week.
And that's an understatement, that she's a violinist. You're way more.
Very good. Well, listen, thank you for sharing, each and every single one of you. That's really, I'm really grateful. We are going to do a whirlwind tour over the next 4 weeks about the history of the church, Anglican polity, the Book of Common Prayer, our hymnal and worship, baptism and Eucharist, and as I said, the history of the Diocese of Ohio and St. Paul's. I do have a list of reference books, which I will email out to all of you after we're done today. And it's a resource list of books that I think might be helpful. And I'll add to that as we go along, especially with regard to the Book of Common Prayer. And I hope, because these are going to be sort of action-packed presentations, hope to have a little bit of time for questions at the end. But I also hope that as you cogitate over things throughout the week, that if you have questions, that you won't hesitate either emailing me or giving me a call, because I'm at home. So, you know, a phone call from you would be lovely. And an email from you would be lovely if you have questions or want further explanation about things. So with that, hang on to your seats. We are going to do an amazingly fast skim through the history of the church and how the Episcopal Church branched off from the Anglican Church of the Church of England. So we go back to 1517, which is sort of the year of the beginning of the Protestant Reformation in Europe. But we might say, you know, the Church Universal was a single, happy, and harmonious institution, except it wasn't. And you have to remember that for the first 300 years of Christianity's existence, it was illegal to be a Christian. Then along came this soul named Constantine, who in a dream bargained with God that if he was successful in battle, he would convert to Christianity. And voila, he was successful in battle, so he joined his mother's church. And while he didn't make Christianity the state religion, he did in 313 legalize Christianity so that Christians weren't persecuted for practicing their faith in public. Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire several decades later after Constantine. Moreover, he had a new monetary coin struck in which his image, along with the Greek initials for Christ, the Chi-Rho, appeared. And well, we all know what happens when the emperor changes religion. Everyone wants to become a Christian, which I'll share more about when we talk a bit about baptism next in a couple of weeks. The first 1,000 years of Christianity was filled with enough change, drama, and politics to warrant a binge-worthy Netflix drama. And in 1054, there was a divide between the Western Church, which became known as the Roman Catholic Church, and the Eastern Church, which became known as the Orthodox Church. From that point on, I have to say the Eastern Church remained for a very long time largely hidden and to itself. And the Western Church began a process which proved that the church, while divinely inspired, was and is indeed a very human institution, filled with its own foibles, even while evolving along with Western civilization. The language of education and the language of the church became Latin, which we'll bear on our conversation a little later on, and also when we talk about the prayer book. To speak about the history of the church, we have to first visit a chapter in church history which references the Protestant Reformations in Europe, which took place again between the year 1517, when a monk named Martin Luther nailed his call for reform on the church door in Wittenberg, Germany, and about 1648, which was the conclusion of the 30-Year War, which unfortunately killed about 40% of Germany's population at that time. The Reformation in Europe was a theological reformation. Started when Martin Luther, who really wanted to reform the Roman Catholic Church, and when that didn't happen, the Lutheran Church was born, although Martin Luther would have preferred the term Protestant. The Reformation in Germany was followed by reformations in Switzerland, Sweden, Austria, eventually making its way to merry old England. Now, the Reformation in England began as a political reformation. Around 1529, when Henry VIII, who had been called the defender of the faith, by the way, by the Pope, because he wrote a treaty against Martin Luther, when he asked the Pope to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon because she couldn't give him a male heir. And here you see the wives of Henry VIII. None of them, except for Jane Seymour, was able to give Henry a male heir. And so it was not a very good thing to be a wife of Henry VIII at that point. It became a theological reformation by 1534, when by a virtue of the Act of Supremacy in Parliament, Henry was declared the head of the Church of England. So the church in England became the Church of England. And he was the head, and every monarch since Henry's time has been the head of the Church of England. Thomas Cranmer was the first Archbishop of Canterbury, who was also tasked with bringing the language of prayer from Latin into the language of the people, of course, English. The first books of common prayer were largely authored by Thomas Cranmer and printed in 1549 during the brief reign of Edward the Sixth, Henry's only male heir. And that first prayer book revision followed in 1552. So we had the first prayer book printed in 1549, and then in 1552, it was revised. After a brief return to Roman Catholicism during the reign of Mary, Queen of Scots, the 1552 prayer book was reintroduced by Queen Elizabeth I with a few minor tweaks. And a third, much more comprehensive prayer book revision took place in 1662 during the time of Charles II. And this has been, incidentally, the official prayer book of the English Church ever since, although they've had a number of supplemental worship materials in that time. Now, I have to jump across a painful amount of history to get to the establishment of the church in the New World. Sir Walter Raleigh made 2 attempts to found the first permanent English settlement in North America. The first colony was established by Governor Ralph Lane in 1585 on Roanoke Island in present-day North Carolina. And following the failure of that settlement, a second colony led by John White landed on the same island in 1587 and became known as the Lost Colony due to the unexplained disappearance of 121 colonists, most of whom were Anglicans, a mystery which remains unsolved to today. In 1607, 104 English men and boys arrived in North America to start a settlement on May 13th, and they picked the name Jamestown in Virginia for their settlement. Jamestown named after their king, James I. The settlement became the first permanent English settlement in North America. Ruins of the church in Jamestown are considered to be the oldest in the United States, dating back to about 1639. Now, on other fronts, back in merry old England, Archbishop William Laud, a favorite advisor of the King Charles I and a dedicated Anglican, sought to suppress religious practices of Puritans and other non-conforming beliefs in England. And this, of course, resulted in the December 1620 journey of a group of Puritans from England to establish Plymouth Colony just to the south of Massachusetts Bay. We know these Puritans, of course, as the Pilgrims. They were seeking only to preserve their cultural identity and to attain religious freedom. In 1628, the Massachusetts Bay Colony became the first English chartered colony whose board of governors did not reside in England. And that's important because it gave them a certain amount of independence, helping the settlers to, again, maintain their Puritan religious practices without interference from the king, Archbishop Laud, or the Anglican Church. Now, skipping again over lots of fun historical facts, by 1776, the Anglican Church did get a foothold in the emerging colonies in North America, and you're probably already aware that 2/3 of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were Anglicans. Next, we have a couple of representations of that little skirmish called the Revolutionary War, right? This first one is Washington crossing the Delaware, and the second is a painting entitled The Spirit of '76. I'm just curious if any of you know where this painting was in fact created. It's a Jeopardy question. Hold it, wait for it. Wellington, Ohio, which is just actually 8 miles south of Oberlin, where I am right at the moment. The Revolutionary War raged between April 1775 and September 1783, and by the time it was over with, it pretty much decimated the Anglican Church in America. The clergy, by virtue of their ordination vows, took an oath of loyalty to the English monarch. And so these clerics either returned to England before or during the war, or they went into exile in the Canadian colonies. At the end of the war, it's estimated that there were only about 4 priests left in the entire original 13 colonies. But that faithful remnant got together fairly quickly and set about organizing themselves into what would become the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America, known by the acronym PECUSA. The issue is that while there were a few priests, there wasn't yet a bishop in this newly forming communion. And because there were no bishops, the making and ordering of new priests was not possible. For to be ordained meant making a perilous journey back across the ocean to England, and being ordained in England meant taking an oath of conformity to the king. So the new burgeoning church really needed to have a bishop of their own. And in fact, they needed to get at least 3 bishops, which I'll tell you about in just a minute. Enter a character by the name of Samuel Seabury, who was a leading loyalist in New York City during the American Revolution, which, by the way, would garner him a minor leading role in the Broadway musical Hamilton, right? This is him right here on his soapbox. Seabury was arrested in November 1775 by local patriots and was kept in prison in Connecticut for about 6 weeks, where he was prevented from carrying out his ministry. And after some time on Long Island, he took refuge in New York, where he was appointed chaplain to the King's American Regiment in 1778. At the end of the war, instead of skipping back to England or up to Canada, he decided to stay and he moved to Connecticut, and he became loyal to the new government. On March 25th, 1783, a meeting of 10 Episcopal clergy at the Glebe House in Woodbury, Connecticut, elected Samuel Seabury as their bishop. Now, I have to tell you, he was their second choice. Their first choice was a favorite son who refused because of ill health. But as there was no Anglican bishop in North America to consecrate Seabury, he sailed to London on July 7th. In England, however, his consecration was considered to be impossible because, as an American citizen, he could no longer take that oath of allegiance to the king. He was received very warmly by the British bishops and the Anglican Church there, in part because he had been a loyalist during the war. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why they thought he might get consecrated in England, was because of his ties, but no go, because he was not willing to take the oath of allegiance. So he turned to the non-juring bishops of Scotland, of the Scottish Episcopal Church. Non-juror is the term used for those who refuse to take the 1688 oath of allegiance to the new monarchs, William III and Mary II. And while the Scottish Episcopal Church was recognized by the Church of England, the bishops of the Scottish Episcopal Church did not have to take that oath of allegiance, so they were considered what were called non-juring. Now, Seabury was consecrated at Aberdeen on November 14th, 1784, on the condition that he would study the Scottish rite of Holy Communion and work for its adoption rather than the English rite of 1662, when the new church was setting up shop to print their own prayer book. So the present day, the American liturgy that we have in what's called Rite 1 of the Eucharist is, in fact, the Eucharist was based on the Scottish Episcopal Church. Seabury was consecrated a bishop by Robert Kilgore, who was the Bishop of Aberdeen and the Primus of Scotland. He was also consecrated by Arthur Petrie, who was the Bishop of Ross and Moray, and he was consecrated by John Skinner, who was the coadjutor bishop of Aberdeen. 3 bishops to make 1 bishop. That's the rule, and that's something we want to remember. It takes 3 bishops to make 1 bishop. The consecration, incidentally, took place in Skinner's house in Longacre, Scotland. Seabury's consecration by the non-juring Scots caused alarm in the British government, who feared further fractions in the relationship between the Church of England and other places where Anglicans were setting up shop, most notably the United States. So England's Parliament was persuaded to make provision for the ordination of foreign bishops, and Seabury's perseverance in the matter had the effect of making it possible a continued relationship between the American and the English churches. Seabury returned to Connecticut in 1785, and on August 3rd, the first Anglican ordinations on American soil took place at Christ Church in Middletown. Seabury was also a mover and shaker in the establishment of the Episcopal Church in the first general conventions of 1785 and 1789. He joined eventually with William White, the Bishop of Pennsylvania, and Samuel Prevost, who was the Bishop of New York, both of whom had been ordained at Lambeth Palace Chapel in London, and then James Madison, who was the Bishop of Virginia, who was consecrated at Canterbury Cathedral, uniting the Scottish and the English apostolic successions as they consecrated the first bishop on American soil, the Right Reverend Thomas Cleggett. Now, there's a drama here which I wish I could get into because it's really soap opera worthy, and that is, you heard me say it takes 3 bishops to make a bishop. Well, now you have got Samuel Seabury, William White, Samuel Prevost, and James Madison. That's 4 bishops, right? And they decided that in order to be a united front, all 4 of them needed to be at this consecration of Thomas J. Cleggett, except that William White and Samuel Prevost didn't exactly get along very well. And in fact, they didn't get along, and so they were both threatening not to come to the consecration. And what ended up happening was Samuel Seabury tricked them into coming to dinner, told them to come to dinner, but he didn't tell each of them that they were coming to dinner. And then he locked the doors of the house and basically said, "You're not leaving till we get this ironed out." Thankfully, they got it ironed out, and they all 4 showed up for the consecration of Thomas Cleggett. Thomas Cleggett, a man of excellent fitness for the office, as well as somebody who possessed private means, He was elected first Bishop of Maryland, consecrated during the Triennial General Convention of the Episcopal Church meeting that year at Trinity Church on Wall Street in New York City. His consecration took place on September 17, 1792, making him the first bishop of the Episcopal Church ordained and consecrated in North America, and the fifth bishop consecrated for the Episcopal Church in the United States. Now let's talk very briefly about polity. A faith tradition's polity is its political structure and organization, and misunderstandings about how we Anglican Episcopalians govern our common life can and has resulted in some pretty serious divisions amongst us. Historically, there are four polities within Christian bodies: congregational, presbyterial, Episcopal, and Anglican. And two of those polities probably sound like familiar American Christian faith traditions: the Congregational Church and the Presbyterian Church. And you may be scratching your head about the last two, Episcopal and Anglican, because, well, aren't they the same thing? Scratch your head some more, because they're not. The Episcopal Church in the United States is founded on Anglican polity rather than Episcopal polity. But let me take a step back and define these other polities as they are up on the slide. Congregational polity rests on the principle of government that each and every member of the local, autonomous, independent congregation has a voice. This is indeed the polity of the Congregational Church, now called the United Church of Christ in the United States of America, but it's also the polity of most Baptist churches as well. That means that each member has a say in all the decisions that are getting made. And the joke is that, you know, in the Congregational Church, you can't paint the front door unless you have a congregational meeting. That's not quite true, but that gives you a bit of a sense of how that goes. The Presbyterial polity rests on the principle of governance by elected representational bodies of clergy and laity, and there's a ordered hierarchy. This is, in fact, the polity of the Presbyterian Church in the USA. Episcopal polity rests on the principle of governance by bishops, either elected or chosen for life or for a stated term, typically in what we call apostolic succession, but not always. And this is the polity of the Roman Catholic Church, the Methodist Church, and the American Lutheran Church. Now, I have to tell you that the best way for me to explain the idea of terms versus life appointment and apostolic succession is to say that the Roman Catholic Church, if you're consecrated a bishop, and in the Episcopal Church, if you're consecrated a bishop, you're consecrated for life. And because the Episcopal Church was part of or came off of the Roman Catholic Church, they brought with them this sense of apostolic succession, which is the idea that when three bishops lay their hands on another person, they're doing something that has gone on all the way back to St. Peter. Now, I'm just enough of a genealogist to say, show me the paperwork. And of course, we can't do that, right? But it is a powerful idea that we carry through the church, that this is something that happens, that has happened for a long time in Christianity. That's not true of the United Methodist Church, and it's not true of the Lutheran Church as well. In the Methodist Church and the Lutheran Church in America, bishops are appointed for a term, usually 3 to 6 to 9 years, but they're not appointed for life. Once their term is up, they go back to being just a regular Pastor Joe or Jane, right? While Anglican polity rests on a principle of governance, it does so in one that doesn't fit neatly into any of these other three. And that is because although there are some common elements, the congregational polity isn't part of our polity, right? And the polity of the Episcopal Church is also different from other parts of the Anglican Communion, and we'll go into that again as we carry on these next 4 weeks. Moreover, in any other church in the worldwide Anglican Communion, the Episcopal Church is deeply rooted in a representative form of church government. That's because the birth of the Episcopal Church coincided with the birth of our nation. The constitutions of the nation and of the Episcopal Church were ratified in the same city, Philadelphia, in the same building, Independence Hall, in the same year, 1789. But authority in the Episcopal Church is conferred through representatives duly being elected by the people. And for example, vestry members at St. Paul's are elected by the parish. And then representatives to diocesan convention from St. Paul's are elected by the vestry. And then the convention is the group of people who elect deputies to general convention. So authority rests through representatives that are duly elected in each of these on each of these tiers. Now, if you have never been to a winter convocation and taken a course in leadership and church polity by Bishop Hollingsworth, let me point out to you that in a stroke of genius, it was decided to record his presentation several years ago, and you can access these on our diocesan website, www.theohio.org. Just when you go to the Episcopal Diocese of Ohio website, you can look at the menu, and under News and Publications, scroll down to videos, and the first two videos are Bishop Hollingsworth's presentations on polity and leadership. Now, I told you there's not going to be any homework assignments in our course, but I will say, if you want to take a look at these, they're about a half hour each, and Bishop Hollingsworth does a great job of talking about baptismal authority and polity in the Episcopal Church. We are neither a church in which a few people have absolute authority to make unilateral decisions, nor are we a church in which everyone has equal authority to make communal decisions. We understand power as the ability to influence rather than coerce. We understand authority as the right to be heard rather than the right to be obeyed. And while some persons are granted structural authority, that is the right to be heard because of their office, like bishops, most of our understanding of authority works best when it is founded upon a person's proven wisdom, moral example, spiritual being, their charism, the gifts that are given to them, and they're being raised up for different leadership possibilities in the church. As Anglicans, we have typically intended to live by the virtues of honesty, loyalty, good manners, and by that I mean to be polite and courteous and gracious to one another. We also live under the umbrella of mutual respect and restraint and patience. And we also need to understand the political structures and organizations of our church. Our polity is contained in a small volume entitled The Constitution and Canons of the Episcopal Church. The first edition was published in 1789, and it has been revised when the church meets in General Convention every 3 years. Each diocese has a constitution and canons to govern its own life, and each parish should have its own set of bylaws. And in an ideal world, none of these three documents would ever be in conflict with the other two. Canon law does not generally dominate our life, as it does in some traditions, because we have very few professional canon lawyers. Each diocese has a chancellor who has some knowledge of both secular and church law and who acts as a canon lawyer for the diocese. And in the Diocese of Ohio, the chancellor is William Powell, who is also the canon to the ordinary, which is the big fancy Anglican way of saying he's the first assistant to the bishop. And Bill Powell, as some of you may know, is also a member of St. Paul's Cleveland Heights. So rest assured, St. Paul's bylaws, the diocesan canon, constitution and canons, and our national constitution and canons are not in conflict with one another. Bill would know that and would make sure that it would be taken care of. The Anglican Communion is a worldwide assembly of churches which is in communion with the Church of England and recognizes the leadership of the Archbishop of Canterbury. However, unlike the Pope, also known as the Bishop of Rome, the Archbishop of Canterbury has no canonical authority over the member churches of the Anglican Communion. So for example, the Archbishop of Canterbury cannot tell Michael Curry, who is the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, what to do. About every 10 years, more or less, since 1867, the Archbishop of Canterbury has called for the bishops of the Anglican Communion to visit England for what has been called the Lambeth Conference. It's called because it initially took place at Lambeth Palace, which is the castle-like home of the Archbishop in London. The purpose of these conferences has been to discuss mutual concerns, and while this body does have a certain modicum of moral influence, it has no legal authority over the church bodies represented. The next Lambeth Conference was to have taken place this summer, but due to the COVID-19 pandemic, it has been rescheduled for the summer of 2021. The Anglican Communion is composed of 46 different and somewhat autonomous churches, which comprise tens of millions of Christians across our globe. Each member church of the Anglican Communion has its own constitution and canons. It has its own authorized prayer book or books. It has its own authorized hymnal or hymnals, and it has its own authorized translations of Scripture, although with regard to Scripture, those translations sometimes can be used in each of the Anglican communions. So for example, the Revised Standard Version of Scripture is pretty much has been consented to be used across the Anglican Communion, except in places where English is not the first language, and then the Scripture is in the language of that particular church body. So that was it, and I see that I've gone 2 minutes over, so I'm going to ask quickly if there are any questions, if anybody has any questions that they would like to ask for clarification. Kelsey?
Does that mean that Bishop Curry's appointment is for the rest of his life, or does he have
no.
term?
Good question. Bishop Curry, as a bishop, yes, he was initially consecrated as the Bishop of North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
But when he became the presiding bishop, that is a term that is only 9 years long. He has 3 triennials. General convention to general convention is 3 years. So he has 3 of those triennial years, 3 sets of those triennial years to be the presiding bishop, and then he'll retire because he will be old enough to retire from that as well.
How long is he into his?
This is this after he does this next general convention, he'll have that will be it at the general convention 3 years from now. There will be a new presiding bishop elected.
Okay.
Anyone else? I know I just threw a whole lot of information at you in a very quick amount of time. So as I said, I hope that what will happen is that if you have things that you are thinking about, if you have questions, that you'll either give me a call or email me. I'm also, as Jesse and I indicated at the beginning of our time together, we're going to put this up on so that you have the ability to get a hold of it if you want to go back through it again. If you didn't quite hear something or thought, did I really hear Brian say that? Maybe I need to check that out. And then you can ask for questions of clarification that way. Sound good? Thumbs up from people if that works. Excellent. All right, I am going to end tonight with a prayer from a wonderful book by an Irish fellow named John O'Donohue. It's a book of blessings called To Bless the Space Between Us, which I think is just a really wonderful the way of thinking about how to bless the spaces in between us as we're all separate during this time of exile. And the prayer that I'm going to use is from his prayer at the end of the day, which he calls a mirror of questions. So again, mindful that God is with us, let us pray. What dreams did I create last night? Where did my eyes linger today? Where was I blind? Where was I hurt without anyone noticing? What did I learn today? What did I read? What new thoughts visited me? What differences did I notice in those closest to me? Whom did I neglect? Where did I neglect myself? What did I begin today that might endure? How were my conversations? What did I do today for the poor and the excluded? Did I remember the dead today? Where could I have exposed myself to the risk of something different? Where did I allow myself to receive love? With whom today did I feel most myself? What reached me today, and how deep did it imprint? Who saw me today? What visitations had I from the past and from the future? What did I avoid today? And from the evidence, why was I given this day? I wish you all a peaceful night, and thank you so very much for joining this first session.
Thank you, Brian.
Blessings. We'll see you
Thank
next
you.
week.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks,
Thank
Brian.
you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye,
Jess.
everyone.
Thank you, everyone, and
Thank
have a
you.
good night. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good night.